She was 91 years old the last time she rode a train. Her name was Mabel Hartwell, born in 1896 in a New York City tenement that no longer exists, in a neighborhood that no longer exists, to a mother who died of influenza when Mabel was 7 years old, and a father who simply stopped coming home one winter and was never found. She remembered the smell of the tenement. She remembered the sound of the street below her window, the vendors calling out, the horses on the cobblestones. She remembered the day a woman from the Children's Aid Society came to the door and told her and her younger brother Thomas that they were going on a train. That was 1903. She never saw Thomas again after the first stop. In 1994, Mabel Hartwell, then 98 years old and living in a nursing home outside of Columbus, Ohio, gave a recorded interview to a local historical society. She had given interviews before to graduate students and documentary filmmakers and newspaper reporters, and she told her story with the calm precision of someone who had spent 9 decades deciding exactly what to say about it. But in the 1994 interview, she said something she had not said in any previous recording. She said she had gone back. Sometime around 1918, when she was 22 years old, she had retraced the route of her orphan train. She had gone back to the first stop, and she said, quietly and without particular emphasis, that what she found there did not match what she had been told about the place her entire life. The interviewer, a young woman named Carol Emmons, who was working on a thesis about orphan train demographics, did not follow up on that statement. The interview moved on to other things. Carol Emmons finished her thesis, got her degree, and went on to teach high school history in Dayton for 30 years. The recording sat in an archive. It sat there until someone finally listened to the whole thing. To understand what Mabel Hartwell found at the first stop in 1918, you need to understand what the orphan trains actually were, and more importantly, what they were not. The standard history is this. Between 1854 and 1929, an organization called the Children's Aid Society, founded by a minister named Charles Loring Brace, transported somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 children from the cities of the East Coast, primarily New York, to rural communities across the American interior. The children were loaded onto trains, brought to small towns in Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and dozens of other states, displayed on platforms or in town halls or church basements, and distributed to farming families who wanted labor, or childless couples who wanted heirs, or households that simply had room for one more person. That is the official story. The towns that received the children believed they were being charitable and practical at the same time. The children had no vote in the matter. But there is something underneath that history that has never been fully examined. Something in the logistics, something in the numbers, something in the specific geography of where the trains went and where they stopped, and what the towns that received the children actually looked like when those children arrived. Because here is what most accounts of the orphan trains never discuss. The towns were already built. Not recently built, not frontier settlements thrown up in a season with rough lumber and optimism. The towns where the orphan train stopped were, in many cases, communities with substantial architecture, multi-story buildings, wide, well-planned streets, civic structures that would have required years of construction and significant capital, infrastructure that implied a previous population large enough to demand it, organized enough to build it, and wealthy enough to maintain it. And in 1903, when 7-year-old Mabel Hartwell arrived at the first stop on her orphan train route, many of those buildings showed something that she would spend the next 15 years trying to understand. They showed signs of being partially buried, not buried in the sense of ruins overgrown by jungle, buried in the sense that the ground floor windows of many buildings were at an unusual height, buried in the sense that what residents called the basement was in many cases a set of rooms with high ceilings and good light and remnants of plasterwork that suggested they had once been living spaces, not storage. Buried in the sense that if you walked around certain buildings and looked at the foundation line, the stonework below ground level was of a different and often superior quality to the stonework above it. Mabel noticed this as a 7-year-old because 7-year-olds notice things that adults have stopped seeing. She noticed that the house she was placed in had a front door that you had to go up 3 steps to reach, but that those 3 steps were not original to the building. She noticed that the windows of what was called the cellar were the same style as the windows of the main floor, which struck her as strange even at 7 because cellars did not have decorative window frames. She noticed that the town seemed, in a way she could not articulate as a child, too big for itself, too grand for a farming community in the Indiana flatlands. She noticed, and then she grew up and got on with surviving, and she did not think about it again for 15 years. What happened in 1918 to send her back? She found a photograph. Mabel had married at 18. In 1914, a man named Robert Hartwell who worked the railroads. Through his connections, she had access to things that ordinary people did not have easy access to, including freight schedules and route maps, and, in one case, a collection of photographs that a retired railroad surveyor was selling off from his estate. The collection included photographs of depot towns taken during survey trips in the 1880s and 1890s. Mabel was looking through them idly, the way you look through things that are being sold, not expecting to find anything personal. She found a photograph of the town where she had been placed. The photograph was dated 1887. The town in the photograph was virtually identical to the town she had arrived in as a child in 1903. The same buildings, the same street layout, the same architectural details she had spent years half remembering. But the photograph was taken 16 years before her arrival, and in the photograph the streets were largely empty. Not the emptiness of an early morning, the emptiness of a place that is not actively inhabited. The storefronts had their shutters closed. The residential streets had no visible activity. The photograph had the quality of a place that was standing and whole and completely, utterly still. She bought the photograph for 25 cents and spent the next several months arranging to go back. What she found when she got there in 1918 is where this story becomes something other than a simple human interest account of an orphan retracing her roots. The first thing she found was that nobody in the town knew when the main buildings had been built. This is not as unusual as it sounds. Small towns in the American interior were not always meticulous record keepers. Fires destroyed courthouses and their contents with some regularity. Floods took records. The bureaucratic infrastructure of the early American interior was fragile and inconsistent. It is entirely possible, in a perfectly normal world, for a small Indiana town to have lost its earliest construction records. But Mabel was a methodical woman. She went to the county seat. She went to the state capital. She wrote letters to the organizations that had underwritten development in that region in the mid-19th century. She was not able to find, in any record she could access, documentation of when the principal buildings of that town had been constructed, by whom, or at what cost. What she found instead was a gap. There were records of the town from the late 1870s onward. Tax records, census records, property transfers, the ordinary paper trail of a functioning community. Those records showed a town that was already substantially built, already occupied, already operating, as of the earliest records in the 1870s. Before that, there was almost nothing. Not nothing in the sense of a clean slate, nothing in the sense of an absence where something should be, because the buildings themselves told a story that the records did not. The stonework, the style of the masonry, the proportions of the windows and doors, all of it pointed to construction methods and architectural fashions that were not consistent with the 1860s or 1870s. They were consistent with something older, something that architectural historians examining similar buildings in similar towns decades later would consistently place in a period earlier than the official record of the region's settlement. Mabel walked the town in 1918 with the photograph from 1887 in her hand. She walked it block by block, and she began to notice something that the photograph had not prepared her for. The ground level had changed, not everywhere and not dramatically, but in specific places, on specific blocks, in ways that were consistent rather than random. The relationship between the buildings and the street had shifted. There were buildings where the first floor windows, which in the 1887 photograph appeared to sit at roughly knee height relative to the street, now appeared to sit at roughly waist height. The change was subtle enough that you would not notice it if you were not specifically looking. But Mabel was looking, and the change was real. Sometime between 1887 and 1918, approximately 30 years, the street level around those buildings had risen. She asked about it. The postmaster, the dry goods owner, an elderly woman who ran the boarding house. None of them could explain it. When Mabel pointed it out, comparing the window heights to the photograph, the responses were variants of the same thing. It had always been like that as far as anyone knew. Perhaps the street had been regraded. Perhaps she was misremembering the photograph. She was not misremembering. The street had risen. The buildings had stayed where they were. Whatever had raised the street level had done so gradually enough that the people living through it had not registered the change as remarkable. Or they had registered it and then forgotten. Or the people who had registered it were not the same people Mabel was talking to in 1918, because there had been a period somewhere in the recent past when this town had not been fully inhabited, and the people she was speaking to were the inheritors of that emptiness, not the witnesses to whatever had caused it. Now comes the part of this story that the official history of the orphan trains does not address, and that the official history of American westward settlement does not address, and that the standard academic treatment of 19th century American demographics does not address. Where did all the people go? The towns that received the orphan trains were not new. They were not being populated for the first time. They were being repopulated. The infrastructure existed, the buildings existed, the streets existed. What was missing was the people. The Children's Aid Society was not, in this reading of events, building new communities in the American interior. It was filling empty ones. The children on those trains were not pioneers. They were settlers in the most literal sense, people being settled into existing structures in existing towns, which had been standing and waiting and largely unoccupied for a period that nobody in authority seemed eager to acknowledge or explain. The question of what had happened to the previous inhabitants opens a door that the historical record is not equipped to walk through. Look at the census records for the American interior in the mid-19th century. A town does not appear in one census as a small settlement and then appear in the next as a 1,000-person community. That pattern of organic growth is what you see in some places, but in others towns appear already substantially populated, already built, already functioning, as if they had been put there fully formed, or as if they had been there before and simply had people return to them. The architectural evidence is consistent with this reading. The buildings in the orphan train destination towns are not, in many cases, the buildings you would expect to find in communities that developed through the standard model of American interior settlement. They are more elaborate, more durable, built to a standard that implies not just resources but a building tradition, a set of techniques and aesthetics that would have had to come from somewhere. The somewhere is the question. Mabel Hartwell did not use the word Tartaria. That word, that framing, was not available to her in 1918. She was a 22-year-old woman with a railroad worker husband and a sharp mind and a 7-year-old's memory of arriving in a town that was already too big and too grand and too still for what she had been told it was. She did not have the vocabulary for what she was looking at, but she had the observation. And the observation was sound. What she was looking at was the residue of a previous occupation, a previous civilization, if you want to use a grander term, a previous presence in the American landscape that had built these structures and laid out these streets, and then, at some point that the historical record refuses to pin down, had stopped being present, had been removed or had departed, or had been erased in some way that left the physical infrastructure intact, but took the people. And into that absence, the orphan trains had come, children loaded onto trains in New York City, children whose parents were dead or missing or simply unable to be found, children who had no documented history, no family to ask questions on their behalf, no community that would notice if they were placed in a town that did not quite add up, children who would grow up in those towns and accept them as normal because they had no previous experience of normal to compare them against, children who would become the new inhabitants of places that had already had inhabitants, that had already been built for someone else's use, and who would never think to ask who that someone else had been. Mabel thought to ask. She asked because she had a photograph from 1887, showing a town that was empty but intact. She asked because she had noticed, at age 7, that the cellar windows were the wrong kind for cellar windows. She asked because she had grown up with the particular alertness of someone who had learned early that the official version of events was not always the complete version of events. What she found at that first stop in 1918 did not answer her questions, it deepened them. She found that the buildings along the main street had a specific architectural feature that she had never seen in any building she knew to have been constructed in the 1860s or 1870s. The feature was in the proportions of the window arches, not rounded arches, not the flat lintels of strictly utilitarian frontier construction, but a specific profile that implied a different influence, a different training, a different source of design knowledge than the standard American vernacular architecture of the period. She could not have known in 1918 that researchers working much later would identify similar architectural profiles in buildings scattered across a remarkably wide swath of the American interior. Buildings in towns that had no official connection to each other, in states that shared no common cultural heritage, built supposedly by settlers from different regions with different backgrounds, all showing the same profile, all showing the same proportions, all suggesting, if you were willing to follow the implication, that they had been built not by many different groups of settlers in many different eras, but by a single building tradition operating across a very wide territory at roughly the same time, a building tradition that predated the American settlement period, a building tradition that, if you traced it back through the architectural evidence alone, without the assistance of the historical record, would take you somewhere the historical record does not go. She found that the town had structures at its outskirts that were not on any map she could obtain, not large structures, not obvious, but foundations partially exposed that extended beyond the official footprint of the settlement. Stone foundations, built to the same standard as the buildings in town, arranged in patterns that suggested structures larger than any single family home, oriented to the compass in ways that were consistent with deliberate planning rather than organic development. She asked around about these foundations. She was told they were old, nobody knew exactly how old, and that there had been a time when people in the town had discussed trying to excavate them, but nothing had ever come of it. She was told by the elderly woman who ran the boarding house that her own mother had told her that when the first families had arrived in the area, meaning the families the woman considered to be the founding families, the structures in town had already been standing. Her mother had said it like it was simply a fact, not a mystery. The buildings were there. The families moved in. That was the history as the woman's mother had received it and passed it on. When did the families arrive? The 1860s, the woman said, just after the war, the period when, across enormous stretches of the American interior, the historical record is thinnest. The period when population displacements of various kinds, official and unofficial, documented and undocumented, were occurring on a scale that the standard historical narrative has never fully reconciled with the physical evidence on the ground. Mabel left the town in 1918 with more questions than she had brought. She left with her photograph and a notebook of observations and measurements, walking the streets with a piece of string and a carpenter's level borrowed from her husband's toolbox. She did not publish her findings. She did not find anyone to tell who seemed capable of understanding what she was describing. She went home and carried what she knew the way you carry something that has no proper place to be put down. 94 years later, Carol Emmons, the historian who had interviewed her, went back through the recording. Carol had retired from teaching and had become interested in the way certain stories get told and certain stories get left in archives. She remembered the interview with Mabel Hartwell. She remembered that missed moment, and the memory of it had stayed with her across 3 decades of teaching other people's children about other people's history. She went back to the archive. She found the recording. She listened to the full thing, not the edited version that had made it into the Historical Society's collection, but the complete unedited audio, 3 hours and 40 minutes of an old woman's voice in a nursing home talking about a life. And she heard it. The quiet statement, delivered without drama, that Mabel had gone back in 1918, and that what she had found did not match what she had been told. And then, several minutes later in the recording, in a section that had apparently not been transcribed, something more. Mabel describing the foundations outside the official town limits, Mabel describing the window heights, Mabel describing the photograph and the empty streets and the 30 years of rising ground. And then Mabel saying something that Carol had to play back twice before she was sure she had heard it correctly. Mabel said that she had found in the lower level of the building she had lived in as a child rooms that were sealed. Not simply closed, sealed in the sense that the doorways had been filled in with masonry at some point, and the masonry was newer than the surrounding wall, and the quality of the work was inferior to the original construction. Someone, at some point, had closed off rooms that had previously been open. The work was rough, done quickly, done by people who were not as skilled as the builders of the original structure. She had found one room that had been only partially sealed, not enough to prevent entry for a small person. Mabel in 1918 was a small person, and she had gone in. She described a room with a high ceiling and walls that still showed traces of painted plaster. Not painted in the utilitarian sense of a cellar or storeroom, painted in the sense of a decorated interior. The paint was damaged by moisture, but she could make out colours, blues and ochres in patterns that she described as having the quality of the patterns she had seen in pictures of old European churches, though she had never been to Europe and her reference was imprecise. A geometric quality, a deliberateness. There was furniture. Not intact furniture, but the remains of furniture, wooden pieces that had collapsed under the weight of years and moisture into something you could only identify as furniture if you already knew that was what you were looking at. The fragments suggested pieces that were larger and more substantial than typical domestic furniture of any American period she was familiar with. Chairs or benches of unusual proportion. A table, possibly, though the fragments were so deteriorated that she was not certain. And on the far wall of the room, a window, not a basement window of the small horizontal type. A full-height window of the same style and proportion as the windows of the main floor above. Covered on the outside with earth, as she confirmed by pressing her hand against the glass and finding it cold and meeting resistance, the cold resistance of packed soil pressed against the exterior surface. The window was buried, the room was buried. The room had been a living space, and then it had been sealed, and then the ground outside had risen or been raised until the window that once looked out at street level was now looking at the underside of the earth. She did not linger in the room. She came back out the way she had entered. She replaced the material she had moved as best she could. She did not tell the current residents of the building what she had found. She was 22 years old, and she understood in the practical way that people who have had no one to speak for them understand these things, that there was no one who would take her account seriously. She was an orphan who had been placed in that building as a child by a charitable organization. She had no standing, she had no credentials, she had a notebook and a string measure and a photograph, and a memory of a room with painted walls buried under a town that nobody could accurately date. She went home. Carol Emmons, listening to this account in her retirement, did three things. She contacted the Historical Society and asked for the complete file on Mabel Hartwell's interview. She contacted architectural historians at 2 universities and described, without providing location details, the architectural features Mabel had described, including the window profiles, the foundation layouts, and the interior painted plasterwork. And she drove to Indiana. She found the town. She found the building where Mabel had been placed, which was still standing. She found that the current owners had no knowledge of any sealed rooms in the lower level. She found on the exterior of the building, at what would have been ground level if you subtracted approximately 2.5 to 3 feet of accumulated material from the current street grade, a line in the stonework. A subtle but definite change in the finish of the stone. Above the line, the stone was worked to a standard consistent with mid-19th century American construction. Below the line, the stone was worked to a different standard. Smoother, more precise. The joints between the stones were tighter. The facing was more carefully dressed. 2 different building episodes, 2 different sets of hands, 2 different moments in time. The upper portion was the later addition, the above-ground work that the official record could account for. The lower portion was something older, something that predated the official history of the building, finished to a quality that the official history of the region could not easily explain. Carol Emmons published a small article in a regional historical journal in 2003. The article was careful and academic and did not make any claims it could not support with direct evidence. It described the architectural anomalies. It described Mabel's account. It noted the discrepancy between the official construction record and the physical evidence. It asked, in the measured language of academic inquiry, whether the standard historiography of American interior settlement was complete. The journal had a circulation of approximately 800 people. Nobody responded, but the questions remain. They remain in the architecture, in those buildings that are too grand and too strange and too consistent across too wide a territory to have arisen from the process the official record describes. They remain in the census records, in those sudden appearances of substantially built communities with no documented origin. They remain in the orphan trains themselves, in the logic of transporting 100,000 children from eastern cities to the interior, not to build new communities, but to fill existing ones that had, by some mechanism the record will not disclose, become empty. They remain in the account of a 22-year-old woman in 1918, standing in a buried room under a town she had been placed in as a child, looking at painted walls that belonged to no history she had ever been taught. The town in the photograph is empty. The streets are full of light. The buildings are intact and clean and waiting. The picture was taken in 1887, and nothing is moving, and no one is there. 16 years later, a 7-year-old girl from a New York tenement steps off a train and is walked down a street that is already old and already built, and already, in some way she cannot name, already finished, already completed, already arrived at its final form before the people who were supposed to have built it had any reason to build it for. She grows up in that town, she marries and leaves, she finds a photograph that makes her go back. She goes back and measures and observes and enters a room that should not exist, and finds painted walls in a basement that was never a basement. And then she goes home and carries what she knows for 76 years before saying it out loud to a young historian with a tape recorder who will listen to the whole tape in her retirement and then drive to Indiana and find the line in the stone. The line is still there. The building is still standing. The sealed rooms, if they are still sealed, are still below the street. And the ground is still higher than it should be, measured against the photograph, measured against the window heights, measured against the foundation line where the quality of the stone changes and the official history runs out and something older and stranger and more durable than any record we have been allowed to keep begins. What was here before the settlers arrived? What was here when the buildings were new and the streets were clean and the photograph was taken and there was no one in the frame? What filled those rooms before they were sealed, and who sealed them and why? And where did the people who had lived in them go when the ground began to rise? Mabel Hartwell lived to be 101 years old. She died in 1997. The notebook she had taken to Indiana in 1918 was not found among her possessions. The photograph was found in a shoebox in her closet in an envelope with no label. It is now in the collection of the Historical Society. The streets in it are empty. The buildings are intact. And somewhere in the lower level of a building on the main street of a small Indiana town, behind a wall that was not built by the same hands that built the wall around it, there is a room with a buried window and the remains of painted plaster in blues and ochres that nobody alive has looked at since a young woman with a piece of string and a borrowed carpenter's level slipped through a gap in the masonry and stood in the quiet underground of a history that has not yet been told.